There is a number that gets repeated so often in casual conversation about ancient humans that it has become a kind of trivia reflex. Life expectancy in the Stone Age was around 30 years old. This number is technically true and almost completely misleading at the same time. And untangling why is one of the more satisfying exercises in historical myth-busting that the field of paleodemography has to offer. Because the popular image this number conjures, a 30-year-old hunter-gatherer collapsing from old age, creaky joints, gray hair, the whole package, while everyone around them treats this as an entirely unremarkable and expected event, is almost completely wrong. And the actual explanation for why that number is so low is both more interesting and considerably darker than simple old-fashioned aging. So let us actually take this number apart and see what is really inside it. The first thing to understand is the difference between life expectancy at birth and life expectancy at a later age, because these are two completely different statistics that get casually conflated in ways that produce enormous confusion. Life expectancy at birth is an average. It takes every single person born into a population, including those who die within their first hour of life, and averages their age at death across the entire group. This average is extraordinarily sensitive to infant and child mortality, because death in the earliest years of life pulls the average down dramatically, even if a substantial portion of the population that survives childhood goes on to live a relatively long life by any standard. Here is a simple thought experiment that illustrates exactly why this matters. Imagine a population of 10 people. 5 of them die before their 5th birthday, a grim but historically realistic infant and child mortality rate for many ancient and even relatively recent pre-modern populations. The other 5 survived childhood and lived to the ripe old age of 70. What is the average life expectancy at birth for this population? You add up all 10 ages at death, 5 deaths at roughly age 2 on average, and 5 deaths at age 70, and divide by 10. The math works out to a life expectancy at birth of roughly 36 years. But notice what this number completely fails to communicate. Half the population lived to 70. Nobody in this population died of old age at 36. The number 36 describes a statistical average that corresponds to the actual lived experience of essentially nobody in the group. This is, in simplified form, almost exactly what is happening with the famous Stone Age life expectancy figures that circulate so widely. The low average is driven overwhelmingly by extremely high infant and child mortality, not by widespread early death among adults who survived their childhood. The more revealing and more accurate statistic is life expectancy at a later age, say life expectancy at 15, which measures how much longer an individual could expect to live once they had survived the brutally dangerous early years of childhood. And when paleodemographers calculate the statistic for ancient and prehistoric populations, the picture changes dramatically. Studies of hunter-gatherer populations, both archaeological and from ethnographic observation of contemporary traditional societies, consistently find that individuals who survived to age 15 had a reasonable expectation of living into their 60s or even their 70s. This is not a small correction. This is the difference between a population where everyone dies young and a population where most adults live a genuinely long life by any reasonable historical standard, once you account for the brutal filtering effect of childhood mortality. So, why was childhood mortality so catastrophically high? This is where the actual, interesting, and often genuinely dark substance of this question lives. Infectious disease is the single largest category, and the specific pattern of infectious disease risk changed dramatically across different phases of human history in ways that complicate the simple narrative that things just kept getting worse the further back you go. Hunter-gatherer populations living in small, mobile, low-density groups were actually relatively protected from many of the infectious diseases that became major killers later in human history. Many of the most devastating epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, tuberculosis in its epidemic form, bubonic plague, require population densities and patterns of sustained close contact that simply did not exist in small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. These diseases are, in technical epidemiological terms, density-dependent. They need a sufficiently large, and sufficiently concentrated population to sustain ongoing transmission. Because if the disease burns through a small, isolated group too quickly, it runs out of new hosts to infect, and the chain of transmission collapses. This means that, counterintuitively, the agricultural revolution and the rise of settled, dense population centers actually increased infectious disease mortality substantially compared to the hunter-gatherer baseline, even as it solved certain other problems related to food security. Agricultural villages and later cities created exactly the conditions. Population density, sustained close contact, proximity to domesticated animals that served as reservoirs for zoonotic disease, and contaminated water supplies from concentrated human and animal waste that allowed epidemic diseases to flourish in ways they simply could not in the dispersed, mobile hunter-gatherer world. Childbirth represents the second major category of mortality risk, and its effects were felt across two distinct populations simultaneously: mothers and infants. Maternal mortality in pre-modern populations was staggering by any contemporary standard. Estimates for various historical and traditional populations place the risk of a woman dying as a direct result of childbirth complications somewhere in the range of 1 to 2% per birth, which sounds modest until you account for the fact that women in these populations typically gave birth many times over the course of their reproductive years. A woman who gave birth 8 times across her lifetime, with even a conservative 1% mortality risk per birth, faced a cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth that could easily exceed 5 to 8%, meaning that something like 1 inch 15 to 1 inch 12 women in some historical populations could expect to eventually die as a direct consequence of pregnancy and delivery. The specific causes of maternal death in pre-modern contexts were grimly consistent across cultures and time periods. Hemorrhage, during or immediately after delivery. Infection following delivery. Obstructed labor in cases where the infant's position or size created a mechanical blockage that no amount of effort or skill could resolve without modern surgical intervention. And preeclampsia, and related hypertensive disorders of pregnancy that remained dangerous even with modern medical care, and were essentially untreatable in any pre-modern context. Infant and child mortality, meanwhile, operated through an even broader range of mechanisms, and the sheer scale of it is genuinely difficult to internalize from a modern perspective. Estimates for various pre-modern populations, both historical and prehistoric, suggest that something in the range of 30 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood, with the most dangerous period overwhelmingly concentrated in the first 1 to 2 years of life. Birth complications. Infectious disease in a population with an immature immune system and no access to antibiotics or vaccines. Malnutrition during periods of food scarcity that hit children disproportionately hard. And the simple physical fragility of very young bodies in a world without modern medical intervention combined to produce mortality rates that are almost unimaginable by contemporary standards. This staggering childhood mortality rate is the single largest factor dragging down the famous life expectancy at birth statistics that get casually quoted as evidence that ancient people simply aged faster and died younger across the board. They did not in the sense that matters most for understanding daily lived experience. The children dying in catastrophic numbers were not living shortened adult lives. They were not living adult lives at all. Violence is the third major category, and its contribution to ancient mortality has been the subject of considerable academic debate over the past several decades. Some researchers drawing on archaeological evidence of trauma in skeletal remains and on ethnographic observation of contemporary hunter-gatherer and tribal societies have argued that interpersonal violence, including warfare between groups, accounted for a remarkably high proportion of adult, male deaths in many prehistoric and traditional societies. Estimates in some specific populations range as high as 10 to 20% of all adult male deaths attributable to violence. Other researchers have pushed back against these high estimates, arguing that the specific archaeological sites used to generate them may not be representative of hunter-gatherer society more broadly. Accidents and environmental hazards constitute a fourth significant category, encompassing everything from animal attacks and falls to drowning and exposure to extreme temperatures. A broken bone that might require a brief hospital visit and a cast in the modern world could, in a pre-modern context, lead to infection, prolonged disability, and in severe cases, death from complications that modern medicine would treat as routine. This last point deserves particular emphasis because it is one of the most underappreciated factors in understanding why ancient and pre-modern mortality rates were so much higher than modern rates across essentially every category of risk: the absence of antibiotics. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how completely antibiotics transformed the relationship between minor injury or infection and death. Before antibiotics, a relatively minor wound that became infected could progress to sepsis and death within days, a process that is now almost entirely preventable with a basic course of inexpensive medication. Childbirth infections, surgical infections, pneumonia following a common cold or flu. All of these represented genuine mortal threats throughout almost the entirety of human history, right up until the widespread availability of antibiotics in the mid-20th century. The gap between ancient and modern mortality is not primarily a story about ancient bodies being fundamentally weaker or less robust than modern bodies. It is overwhelmingly a story about the specific tools and interventions available to address threats that have always existed. Now, with all of this context established, let us return to the central question. What did actual adult aging look like for the substantial portion of the population that survived past childhood? The archaeological and ethnographic evidence here is genuinely fascinating. Skeletal remains from individuals who survived to advanced age in prehistoric populations show clear evidence of the same age-related degenerative changes that affect modern elderly populations. Osteoarthritis, dental wear and loss, evidence of healed fractures, and in some cases evidence of conditions like osteoporosis. Contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, studied extensively by anthropologists such as the Hadza of Tanzania, and various groups in the Amazon basin consistently include elderly individuals well into their 70s and occasionally their 80s. These elderly individuals are not marginal curiosities within their societies. They occupy genuinely important social roles, particularly as repositories of accumulated practical knowledge, as caregivers for grandchildren in what anthropologists call the grandmother hypothesis of human longevity evolution, and as sources of social and political authority within their communities. The grandmother hypothesis deserves specific mention because it represents one of the more compelling evolutionary explanations for why humans, almost uniquely among mammals, evolved to live substantially beyond their reproductive years. The hypothesis argues that post-reproductive women who survived into old age provided substantial fitness benefits to their descendants by assisting with childcare, food provisioning, and the transmission of accumulated knowledge, and that this benefit was significant enough to drive the evolution of an extended post-reproductive lifespan in human females specifically. A pattern that strongly suggests our species has been producing substantial numbers of long-lived elderly individuals across a very long stretch of evolutionary history. If ancient humans genuinely and uniformly died at 30, there would be no evolutionary pressure to develop the kind of extended post-reproductive lifespan that the grandmother hypothesis describes, because evolution does not preserve traits that never get expressed. The very existence of a substantial population of long-lived grandmothers is itself powerful evidence that long adult lifespans were a real and recurring feature of human existence throughout deep prehistory. There is another dimension to this story worth unpacking because it concerns how paleodemographers actually reconstruct age-at-death data from skeletal remains. Determining the age at which an ancient individual died relies on biological markers, including the fusion of growth plates, changes in the pelvis, dental wear, and microscopic bone density changes. The problem is that these aging techniques become progressively less precise the older an individual was at death. Distinguishing a 4-5-year-old skeleton from a 6-5-year-old skeleton is genuinely difficult. And for decades, the standard practice involved lumping all adults above roughly age 50 into a single broad old adult category without further discrimination. This methodological limitation had a distorting effect on calculated life expectancy figures. If a population's skeletal sample includes individuals who actually died in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, but the analytical method could only confidently place them in a broad 50 plus category, then any life expectancy calculation built on that data systematically underestimates the true extent of long adult lifespans, compressing what was likely a much wider range of older adult ages into an artificially narrow category. It is worth pausing here to look more closely at the specific demographic data behind one of the most frequently cited ancient populations in this entire discussion, because the numbers themselves tell a more textured story than any single summary statistic can capture. The skeletal collection from the site of Libin, an Ohio Native American population dating to roughly 800 to 1100 CE, and extensively studied by physical anthropologists over several decades, has become something of a textbook example in paleodemographic research precisely because of how thoroughly it has been analyzed. Initial analyses of the Libin skeletal population produced life expectancy figures that fit neatly into the popular narrative. An apparently very low average lifespan, with few individuals appearing to survive much past their 40s or 50s. Later reanalysis of the same skeletal material, using updated and more sophisticated aging methodologies that better accounted for the underestimation problems already discussed, produced a substantially revised picture. A meaningful proportion of the population originally classified into a vague older adult category turned out, on more careful examination, to include individuals who had lived considerably longer than the original analysis suggested. This case study has become something of a cautionary tale within paleodemography itself, illustrating how methodological limitations in aging older skeletons can systematically distort our understanding of how long ancient people actually lived. This pattern of revision is not unique to Libin. Across multiple skeletal populations studied since the mid-23rd century, a recurring trend has emerged in which initial demographic analyses tend to underestimate the number of genuinely elderly individuals, and subsequent reanalysis with improved methods tends to reveal a somewhat older and longer-lived population than originally believed. Let us turn now to comparative studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer populations conducted by researchers including Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan, whose work compiling demographic data across the Hadza, the Ache of Paraguay, the Hiwi of Venezuela and Colombia, and several other groups found a remarkably consistent pattern. High mortality risk concentrated heavily in the first few years of life, a substantial drop during adolescence and prime reproductive years, and then a gradual increase beginning around age 40 or 50 that mirrors the mortality curves observed in modern industrialized populations, just shifted to higher absolute rates at every age due to the absence of modern medical intervention. Their research produced a specific statistic that deserves wider recognition. Across the various hunter-gatherer populations studied, the modal age of adult death, the single most common age at which adults actually died, as opposed to the mean average dragged down by childhood mortality, clustered consistently in the range of 70 to 72 years old. This is genuinely striking because it suggests that the single most statistically common outcome for an adult hunter-gatherer who survived early childhood was not dying at 30 or 40, but living into their seventh decade. There is also a worthwhile comparison to be made with the demographic transition that occurred during the early agricultural period, because evidence increasingly suggests the shift from foraging to farming was not, demographically speaking, a straightforward improvement. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations consistently shows reduced average stature, increased markers of skeletal stress, higher rates of dental disease, and in some populations, evidence of increased rather than decreased childhood mortality during the initial transition to settled agricultural life. This is sometimes called the Neolithic mortality crisis, and it complicates the simple, linear narrative in which human health steadily improved as civilization advanced. There is also a specific and somewhat counterintuitive point worth raising about how disease environments shifted across the broad sweep of human history in ways that complicate any simple story of continuous improvement or continuous decline. periods of severe epidemic disease, including the well-documented waves of bubonic plague that swept through medieval Europe, the catastrophic depopulation of the Americas following European contact, and recurring waves of cholera and typhoid in densely populated pre-modern cities all represent acute crises superimposed on top of already significant background mortality rates. A hunter-gatherer population living in relative isolation faced a meaningfully different disease environment than an agricultural population living in a crowded medieval city during an active outbreak of plague, and lumping both into a single, undifferentiated category called ancient humans obscures more than it reveals. There is one more thread in this story that deserves attention before we close, because it concerns how this whole topic intersects with our own modern psychological relationship to aging and the way we tell stories about the past. The persistent popularity of the 30-year myth serves a kind of narrative function. The idea that ancient humans simply dropped dead at 30 fits neatly into a broader cultural story in which modernity represents straightforward linear improvement over a brutal and short-lived past, flattering the present by exaggerating the deficiencies of everything that came before it. The more accurate picture changes how we think about what modern medicine has actually accomplished. The achievement is not that we have somehow extended the maximum potential human lifespan dramatically beyond what was previously possible, since long adult lifespans into the 70s and beyond were always within the range of human biological possibility. The actual achievement is more specific and, in its own way, more remarkable. We have dramatically reduced the proportion of any given population that fails to survive childhood, that dies from infectious disease in adulthood, that dies from childbirth complications, and that dies from injuries that would once have been fatal but are now routinely treatable. We have not extended the ceiling of human lifespan nearly as dramatically as popular imagination suggests. We have instead dramatically raised the floor. This is both a more accurate and a genuinely more remarkable story than the simple myth it replaces. It is the story of a species that learned gradually and through immense collective effort across many generations to stop so many of its own members from dying before they ever got the chance to discover how long they might otherwise have lived. The number 30 captures something real and tragic about ancient human existence. It simply does not capture what most people assume it captures. And the actual story underneath it is both darker in its specific details about childhood and childbirth, and brighter in its implications about adult longevity than the flattened popular version most people carry around in their heads.